Thank you again for joining me as we do this virtually through YouTube. So we are at part 2 of the Great War, and again, I don't know how many parts this is going to be. It looks like probably 3 parts on the Great War before we transition to the interwar period. But today we're doing part 2. Just a little bit of review first. So the last time we talked about the Schlieffen Plan. This was the plan that Germany had for decades should there ever be a general European war. And so after the Archduke was assassinated and Austria declared war on Serbia, and then Russia came in, declared war on Austria, this triggered all these mechanisms, these alliances that put into action the Schlieffen Plan. And so the premise of the Schlieffen Plan was that any such war, should it occur, would be a local and contained war. Everything would go to plan, and the war would be over by Christmas, and that France would be knocked out in just 6 weeks. And so I've heard different analogies used to describe this military motion, a revolving door, or a hammer. This is the head of the hammer swinging down through France, and then it's going to swing back around to hit Russia. And so we talked about how the plan didn't go quite like it was supposed to. You have French fortress towns through here on the French and German border right here. And what the plan intended to do was to go through neutral Belgium, swing through neutral Belgium to invade the enemy France. But the key was speed, that the German army needs to proceed through Belgium very quickly and get to France, knock them out. Problem is, they faced resistance in France, which was neutral. I didn't mention this last time, I forgot to, but because Belgium was neutral and their neutrality was violated, that is what caused Great Britain to declare war on Germany. Because Great Britain was actually not a part of this complicated alliance that triggered one declaration of war after the other. But because Germany violated Belgium's neutrality, Great Britain saw Germany as the aggressor and declared war on Germany on the side of France and Russia. So that was the plan, the Schlieffen Plan. Knock out France in 6 weeks and then pivot east to Russia, just a great big circle, or a head of a hammer coming around. But the Battle of the Marne River, the Marne Valley, right after Belgium, they got bogged down, and the Schlieffen Plan came to a grinding halt. So that's what we talked a little bit about last time. We also talked about trench warfare, which characterized the Western Front. So when the Schlieffen Plan came to a very abrupt halt, basically what happened is they went to the ground, they fortified their positions, and it resulted in trench warfare. Another thing I didn't mention before, I might as well go ahead and mention, is you'll notice these trenches are very zigzag. The point of that is that if an artillery shell hits in one part, that the explosion is contained to that one small part of the trench. And also, a lot of times, they would raid each other's trenches, and having lots of corners, you can't see around, would protect the other soldiers. And so, just thought I'd mention that since you see the zigzag trenches there. And life was very, 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 very miserable in the trenches. We talked a little bit about that. Schlieffen Plan came to a grinding halt, which caused them to fortify their positions, dig in for the long haul, and that characterized no man's land, which was the territory between the two enemy trenches. And one of the characteristic things about trench warfare is that the sides would take turns launching assaults on each other. And what would happen is literally millions of men would launch an offensive going this way, and they would maybe make it to the next trench, and they would push the enemy back to the next line of trenches back. And then the next side would launch their offensive, just a couple weeks later, and they would push them back to the last line of trenches. And so millions of men were killed just swapping land back and forth, going back and forth with no real meaningful gain or loss. And so there was one quote, I don't have my PowerPoint, where the soldiers would have a little ditty song that they would talk about. We're here because we're here, because we're here, because we're here. In other words, they don't know why we're here, but we're here. We can't explain why we're here. And so the idea behind this was millions of men are being killed, swapping land back and forth. Nothing is being won, nothing is being lost. After the end of every battle, there's nothing really unchanged in the situation other than just more men are dead. And so that really devastated the morale of the men, is they didn't see the purpose of the war. They weren't conquering cities or towns or anything like that. And it wasn't based on strategy. It was just based on, it was a war of attrition. In other words, just wearing down the enemy. Because one thing about trench warfare is you are in constant, perpetual contact with the enemy. You are never, typically through history, Middle Age history, most wars consisted of just one major battle. That was a decisive battle that would be fought maybe in a few days, a week-long battle. And that one battle was basically the entire war. It was very decisive, very quick. But in trench warfare, you would have a single battle, like the Battle of the Marne or the Battle of the Somme, which would last months, several months. And these trenches would span across hundreds of miles. So you may be way out here, 300 miles from the Marne River, and you're asking yourself, were we part of the Marne battle? Because, we're 300 miles from that river, but it's perpetual contact across the whole line. So that's one of the characteristic things about this war is the two sides are perpetually in contact. There is no backing away and then reconvening for a new battle. It's just you have one battle, perpetual contact, months on end, artillery on both sides. It was a war of attrition, just trying to wear down the other side to a nub. And it really took its toll on the men. And so World War I was very much a war of attrition, not based on strategy, just trying to, you put as much men into the meat grinder as you possibly can and try to wear down the enemy. And that's all the strategy there was really in World War I. So that's why I'm not really getting a lot into the individual battles, because when you understand the nature of one battle, what it looked like, you really understand all the battles. So I don't need to show you like maps of the battle and the maneuvers they made, because all the battles were basically exactly the same because of trench warfare. So I'm going to spend most of this lecture talking about the home front, and then I'm going to talk about the role the United States plays, how they enter the war. So on the home front, I think, at least I know I have in the past, when I think of war, a lot of times I tend to think of, this is being fought in a far-off distant land. We're sending our troops across the ocean and to fight in some far-off land. And as Americans, that's what it almost always is in our history. But in Europe's history, that's not the experience for them. They're fighting on their home territory. They're fighting on their cities, in their fields, fighting over their territory. And so the nature of the world wars is very different for Europeans than it is for Americans. So I know that's pretty obvious, but I want you to keep that in mind, that these Europeans are fighting for their homeland. And there's this mentality, I guess, that when you are fighting to protect your family, your home, your community, maybe that somehow brings some sort of extra morale to protect what you have. But what we have here is basically, it's being fought on the European countryside, and a lot of this countryside was used for farming. And a lot of that farmland is converted into battlefields. And so basically, when all of your fields that you depend on for food production turns to battlefields, food production is not happening. And so one of the things characteristic on the home front, as this terminology emerges, is that productivity stops, food production stops, and entire societies are remobilized from their usual production to working for the war effort, producing for the war effort. And so you have fields being converted to battlefields where there is no production of food. And that's just one type of loss that is happening in war. Of course, you also have war weariness. Not only are you losing fields, but you're losing cattle from shelling and artillery. Food is being rationed. in your cities, in your villages. And everyone is mobilized for the war effort. Children, women. This is really when, between World War I and World War II, when feminism makes a significant rise. When the men are set off to the battlefields, women are called from the homes to work in the factories, to produce food, to do all of these things, to mobilize the entire society for the war effort. But that takes a lot of weariness on the home front. You're asking a lot of your people. But that's one thing that's characteristic of World War I. And you just see utter devastation in your homes, in your cities. And it's not just a military war, it's a civilian war too. You are fighting on your own homeland. So on the home front, you have factories who, they may have been producing whatever other luxury goods they produced, automobiles or, I don't know, whatever they produced. And they're being retooled to produce munitions, weapons, ships, tanks, poisonous gas, uniforms, whatever they need for the war effort. And farmers are, there's greater demand for food to feed the soldiers on the front lines. Those men are taken out of the workforce to fight on the battlefields. So there's a greater demand for food and raw materials. But in addition to all of the weight of all this, you also see a very heavy censorship. Any criticism of the war in the newspaper would be censored, would be crushed out. So free speech was not as free during the war. I should show you guys a lot of propaganda posters. I think I have a few in here. But the propaganda posters are really fascinating from this time. Pretty sure I put some in here. I hope I did. I can't remember now. So you have the home front, who is carrying a very heavy load. And you have inflation. Inflation is an extremely underrated force in warfare. So what is inflation? Think of it this way. Let's go back to this graphic. You have fields that produce food, and now those fields are being used as battlefields. Food is no longer being produced. Food becomes scarce. There is a scarcity in food. And so when a key resource like food is scarce, its price goes up. There's a higher demand and there's less production. And so for the little bit of food that is in existence, in the high demand, the price of the food goes up. And so you have extreme inflation. Just the cost of basic necessities is extremely expensive. And that's why you have things like rations. You can only buy so much food during war. And so you have inflation that makes the cost of living at home very expensive to compete over scarce resources, fuel or food or cattle or so forth. And that just compounds this whole, everything that already comes with warfare, inflation just compounds on top of all of that, the entire economic system. And so if you remember, when we talk about the Napoleonic Wars, at the very beginning of the 1800s, I characterized the Napoleonic Wars as the first modern war. And if you guys were here, I would ask you guys why, if you remembered why I said that. But the reason why I said the Napoleonic Wars were the first modern wars is because all of French society was mobilized for Napoleon's wars. So he was at war with the British, he was at war with the Russians. And what Napoleon managed to do is conscription. The entire national population became recruits to the military. Because if you remember, in the French Revolution, they overthrew the estate system. And you have the clergy, the nobility, and the peasants. And the nobility were really the land-owning class, but they were also the ones who controlled the military, any military that was. And the peasants really had nothing to do with military matters. War could be going on, the peasants wouldn't even know about it. But when the estate system was thrown out, that had lasted for hundreds, over 1,000 years, when that system was thrown out, and there's only one class, Frenchmen. That is the only class. Now everyone is in on this war effort because every man is equal. The French Revolution was about enlightenment principles. Every man is created equal. No man is endowed to rule over another man just by, force of nature. And so when the estate system was thrown out, all of French society was mobilized for the war effort. If you're just an ordinary, farmer, you would be conscripted into the military. If you're just an ordinary shopkeeper, you would be conscripted into the military. And so it does not matter what strata of socioeconomic status you came from, you could fight in the military. And sometimes you would be compelled to fight in the military. And so that's what's happening is there's no class system anymore. We're out of the Middle Ages now. And all of society is being mobilized. The factories, the farms, every little ounce of, every corner of society is being made efficient to fuel the war effort. And so if you are a little kid, there's something you can do for your part. If you are a school teacher, or if you are a shopkeeper, or you're a factory worker, whatever you're doing, it would be retooled, retasked to in some way fuel the war effort. So things like war bonds and so forth. And so that nature of modern warfare, total society is mobilized for war. We saw that first with Napoleon in France, but that has really become to full maturity in World War I. And that's one of the things that makes it such a massive war, is because you have French society, British society, German society, Russian society, American society, all completely being retooled, retasked for the war effort. There's no more class system separation anymore. So this is when modern warfare really comes to full maturity. And that's one of the things that makes it so devastating and very characteristic of a modern war, which we will see again in World War II and many other wars after World War II. And so, this was fought on their homeland. And one of the things you'll notice here is 10 million civilian casualties and about 9.7 million military casualties. You have more civilian casualties than you do military casualties. This is very much a war fought on the home front. You have things like disease and starvation from, you don't have your fields producing food. You have to send food to the front lines. Scarcity, shortage in food, and just the incessant shelling, the nonstop shelling of your cities and your villages that would just destroy them. A lot of civilians were killed, about 10 million, and almost 10 million military casualties. So it was a very devastating war. And all of this very much took its toll both on civilian populations and the military population. One story I want to tell you, give you a very short version of the story, because I don't have time to tell the whole story. So the war started in August of 1914. The war was supposed to be over by Christmas of 1914, but it wasn't. They were dug in trench warfare, and neither side was really making much improvement in their position. Just a war of attrition. And so the morale of the men was very low. They didn't understand why they were there. They didn't understand the purpose of this fighting, the decision making behind this war. And so it was Christmas Eve on 1914, and both sides were in the trenches. Sometimes the trenches from one side to the other side was a few hundred yards. Sometimes it was just a few hundred feet. In this case, they were pretty close together. The trenches, the no man's land was very small. And at that night, on Christmas Eve, the British and French soldiers heard Germans whistling and singing in their trenches. They were singing Christmas hymns in German language. But they recognized those songs. Those tunes are the same. They're the same songs they sang. And so, they realized, this is Christmas. They celebrate Christmas. We celebrate Christmas. And so what they decided to do, it really started with one person who was brave enough to stand up out of his trench and make contact with the enemy and just exchange gifts. I have cigarettes. What do you have? Let's make a trade. Let's give each other gifts. And what that turned into was the Christmas truce of 1914, where both sides put down their weapons and decided we're going to celebrate Christmas together. And they were able to see the face of their enemy, get to know them. There was a language barrier, yeah, but it really put a face and a personality to the enemy. They even played a soccer match, or football as they call it, in no man's land. And they took this opportunity to take dead bodies out of their trenches and to bury them, dead bodies that had been decaying for weeks or months that were in the trenches. They took that opportunity to clean out their trenches and bury their dead bodies. And they just had a good time on Christmas Day. This was not planned. Officers did not plan this. It was just organic among the soldiers themselves. But afterwards, after Christmas truce was over and the soldiers had to go back to fighting, they were less willing to fight. They had seen their enemy and realized our enemy on the trench over there is just like us. They're teenagers. They're very young men with, no future, that they don't understand why they're here any more than we understand why we're here. And so for both sides, it humanized their enemy. And they realized, we're not so different from each other. Why are we here? And so there was a less willingness to continue with this fighting anymore. And this horrified the officers. And so the officers declared, never again are we going to allow any kind of truce like this again. And we need, a propaganda campaign to show how evil the enemy is. And so the Christmas truce of 1914, it's a really cool story of the Great War, but it doesn't really have a happy ending because there is no more truce after this. And both sides launch just more aggressive propaganda campaigns to vilify the enemy. This is not someone you sign a truce with. This is the enemy. And so we talked about war weariness at home and, scarcity and inflation and the devastation on the home front. And a lot of this is also compounded again by unrestricted naval warfare. And so you have German U-boats. U-boats are basically like submarines. And they would target, the shipping lanes, civilian ships, carrying goods from North America, United States to Europe. Not military ships, but civilian ships. And they realized that, in the propaganda, this played very badly for the Germans. It made them look like they're attacking civilians. So they decided to stop their targeting of civilian ships. But then what would happen was, so if a U-boat would stalk a ship crossing the Atlantic Ocean, they could capture the civilian ship, but they couldn't destroy the civilian ship. That was part of the rules of warfare at the time, the Geneva Conventions of the time. And so if it was an enemy ship, a military ship, you could destroy it. But if it was a civilian ship, you could just capture it and you could seize its goods. Problem is, what would happen is a U-boat would surface and would tell this merchant ship it would have to surrender. These merchants would take a tarp off a machine gun and they would attack this U-boat. And so this merchant ship now is a military ship. They didn't know it. They were trying to get to surrender. And, they've already made them vulnerable by showing themselves. And so there was, the lines between civilian and military became very blurred. And that made U-boat warfare all the more complicated. And so they decided, we're not going to take our chance. We want to try to capture this merchant ship instead of destroy it. But in return, they're just going to destroy our U-boat by, pulling the tarp off this machine gun and targeting us. And so they changed their policy that we're just going to treat merchant ships the same way we treat military ships. We stalk you, we don't show ourselves, from underwater, we launch our torpedo and we sink you. And so targeting civilian ships. And the U.S. even gave an ultimatum to Germany saying that if there is even one American aboard that ship, it could be a French or British ship, but if there's even just one American, we will take that as an act of war against the United States. The German response was, how do we know who's on the ship? We don't know if there's an American on the ship. We have no way of possibly knowing that. And so it was really an impossible situation that the United States put Germany in. We don't know if there's an American on there, but if we sink this ship and there just so happens to be an American on there, and then we've committed an act of war against the United States. And so it became very complicated. It put Germany in a very complicated position just by undergoing any kind of naval warfare. So you see this propaganda poster here. It says they're looking for us. It's cutting off part of it. Are you one of us? So this, you see the Capitol building, Washington, D.C., and the British or the French are looking across the ocean and asking, They're looking for us. Are you one of us? Are you going to be on our side? So there was a significant push among European governments to try to bring the United States into the war. You know, both sides were stuck in a stalemate in Europe. You know, there was just a war of attrition. No side was gaining anything. And France and Britain were trying to court the United States. Can we bring the United States into the war? And it might give us just enough momentum to push us over the top in this war. Looking for that advantage, trying to bring the United States into the war. And eventually you had the sinking of the Lusitania ship in May of 1915, and an American ship. And this, a lot of times you will see this as the typical explanation for why the United States entered the war, because the Germans sunk an American merchant ship. A lot of times you'll see that as, you know, this is why, this is the cause why the United States declared war, because the Germans sunk an American ship with Americans on it, with American goods, sending goods to Europe. But this is in May of 1915. The United States doesn't declare war on Germany until 1917. And so, even though a lot of sources will tell you the sinking of the Lusitania was why the United States entered the war, that's only a partially correct answer. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that here in a couple of minutes. And I'm going to give you a little bit more nuanced of an answer for why the U.S. enters the war. They don't even declare war until 2 years after the sinking of the Lusitania. So one of the things we see is nationalism and Darwinism. We've talked about social Darwinism and how these two have worked together to, you know, to justify some pretty horrendous things. So this is one quote by a German rabbi. I don't have his name. In the German fatherland, there are no longer Christians and Jews, believers and disbelievers. There are only Germans. And so the nature of the Great War very quickly took on a very highly nationalistic look, in that you are German before you're Christian, or you're Jewish, or you're a believer, or an atheist, or whatever. You are German first. And we have solidarity among Germans. And you see the same kind of propaganda with British and French and American propaganda, that, this national solidarity against the enemy. And especially in Russia, you start seeing pogroms, which are basically like riots against minority groups like Jews and Gypsies and Poles. But a pogrom is almost like a predecessor to the concentration camps that we're going to see in World War II, where you have Jews that are being limited to just this one little village that they're allowed to live in. And so almost like concentration camps. So you have these pogroms. See a map here of Ukraine, where you have these pogroms all over Ukraine and Russia, where Jews and Gypsies and Poles would confine to these little villages, where outside of these villages they'd be persecuted. They have to stay within the village. If you've ever seen the movie Fiddler on the Roof, that takes place, the plot is in a Jewish pogrom in Ukraine. And we talked a little bit about the food shortages and the other types of shortages because of the war. But what you often see in people's understanding for why there's food shortages, or why there's shortage of whatever good, instead of saying, oh, it's the war that's causing these shortages, it's stretching our economy thin, instead what they would say, it's the Jews or it's the Gypsies, and they're not working enough, they're not producing enough, they're corrupt. And they would quite often they would blame these minority groups, these other ethnicities, as this is why we're suffering in this war. You see this again in World War II, where Jews are being blamed for Germany's economic situation, which we'll get into that more when we get to World War II. And so you had this huge backlash against Jews and Armenians also, and Gypsies and Poles and these different ethnic groups, where you have an ethnic aspect being introduced to the war. So the Armenian genocide, for example, in the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is what would eventually become Turkey. You have 600,000 to 1.5 million Armenians killed. So Armenians, again, they were one of these groups who, like the Serbs, the Armenians rejected the legitimacy of the Ottoman Empire and says, we are not Ottomans. We don't belong to your empire. We are a different ethnicity. We don't recognize your legitimacy. But the Ottomans would force these Armenians to fight within their military to defend the Ottoman Empire in the Great War. And these Armenians would be, they saw themselves more as Slavic, Russian. They weren't Slavic, but they had much more solidarity with Slavic populations, like Russian populations, instead of the Ottoman, the Turkish population. And so when the Ottomans would go to war, to go to battle against the Russians, you'd have Armenians that are fighting for the Ottoman Empire. They would lay down their guns, or they would lay down the guns, but they would get out of their lines and they would go to the Russian lines and fire back on the Ottomans. So in other words, they would switch sides in the middle of a battle because they didn't see themselves as Ottoman. They wanted to fight for the Russians. And this turns into a genocide, really, where 600,000, 1.5 million, somewhere in that range, Armenians are killed for being Armenian. And so you have pogroms that are targeting gypsies and Jews. You have the Armenian genocide. And so we've talked about social Darwinism and the role that plays. We've talked about Orientalism also. And a lot of this is coming into full maturity now in World War I, but will continue to mature when we eventually see the Holocaust in World War II. But you see this idea of Darwinism and ethnic conflict starting to become a major theme in the 20th century. Not just in World War I and World War II, but in many, many, many conflicts since World War II, and even in the 21st century, in the 2000s, where more conflicts in the world are ethnic than those conflicts that are not ethnic. So ideas of social Darwinism are coming into maturity. Another was India was a colony of the British, and this was a massive potential fighting force that you have in Indians. So the British recruited 1.3 million Indians to fight on behalf of the British Empire in World War I. And what they would do is whenever they would launch an offensive across no man's land, they would send Indian soldiers in the first wave. They would launch these attacks in multiple waves. So you'd have 20,000 crossing in the first wave, make initial contact with the enemy. Then you'd have another 20,000. And every 6 hours you may have 20,000 or 50,000 or 70,000 soldiers in a single wave being pushed against the enemy. And of course, the earlier waves were the more deadly waves. Those are the ones making initial contact with the enemy. So what the British would do, you had these Indian soldiers who, they're not British, they're not European, they're expendable. We'll put them in the first waves to make initial contact with the enemy. And so you see the British tapping into, the Indian population as part of their military force. So now I'm going to talk about the role of the United States. So Woodrow Wilson was the president at the time, and he was running for re-election during the war. And he was running on the campaign slogan, "He kept us out of the war." Because in the United States at the time, you have a very isolationist mentality. The idea among congressmen and American people is that this is not our war. We have nothing to do with this European war. This is among Europeans. So there's a strong isolationist sentiment. But Wilson recognized the importance that France and British win this war. He recognized the importance that they would win this war. And so he, without bucking against Congress or the American electorate, wanted to find a way to bring the United States into this war because he felt it was necessary that the Americans help the British and French. So he wanted to enter the war, in his words, to make the world safe for democracy. Wilson was a very idealistic president, and he always talked about the war in terms of democracy versus authoritarianism. So he wanted to enter the war to make the world safe for democracy, and he fashioned the United States as the arsenal for democracy. Before the United States formally enters the war, we're sending shipments of arms and munitions and tanks and planes to the Allies, and we are being their arsenal for democracy. And so This poster here demonstrates how the French and British are telling Americans, you're needed. We need you in this war. You're already supporting us, with your weapons and your munitions and so forth, as far as industrial goods. But we need you to actually fight in the war for us. So you see in this poster, you're needed. Come across now. Fight with us. We need you. We need you to end this stalemate. So European powers, especially the British, had long tried to convince the United States to enter into the war. But you have this sentiment and among Americans, this is not our war. And so in March 1917, the British intercept a telegram called the Zimmermann telegram. They intercept this piece of intelligence from Germany to Mexico. The telegram never makes it to Mexico. The British intercept it. And what this Zimmermann telegram was, Germany was sending this offer to Mexico that if Mexico were to invade the United States and to occupy the United States on the North American continent, that they would become too preoccupied to fight the war in Europe. And so it was this offer: if you declare war on the United States, and then later on, when we break this stalemate, we will assist you and go to war with the United States also. And we will give you back the land lost, that Mexico lost to the United States. So these states here in the Southwest. So the Zimmermann telegram was Germany trying to recruit Mexico to join the war on their side, to keep the United States out of the European war. And keep them busy on the North American continent. And the British intercept this telegram. It never makes it to Mexico. And the British, they sit on it. They don't go to the American Congress or the president right away. They sit on it for a little while and wait for the right opportune time. And eventually they do reveal this piece of intelligence to the U.S. president and Congress and says, we have this telegram. Germany is trying to subvert your role in this war. And so the United States takes this Zimmermann telegram. From March to April, they declare war on Germany. They see this as an act of war. And so, yes, it was the sinking of the Lusitania. It was the Zimmermann telegram. It was these working in tandem together that had stressed relations between the United States and Germany that caused the United States to come into the war. The United States was already supplying materially France and Britain, but now the United States decides that we're going to assist actually militarily. We're actually going to send soldiers. And so by April 1917, the United States declares war. It's not really until 1918 that the United States has any kind of meaningful force in Europe, which is towards the very end of the war. But Wilson declares this war as the war to end all wars, or the war to make the world safe for democracy, using very idealistic language. And so that's how the United States comes into this war, very late. I'm basically going to leave off here, give you a little bit short of a lecture. But next time we're going to talk about the Gallipoli campaign. Winston Churchill, who is, what was his title? Vice Admiral of the British Navy, I believe. Eventually he becomes Prime Minister in World War II. We're going to talk about the Gallipoli campaign, what's happening there in the Ottoman Empire. We're also going to talk about setting up the Middle East. Starting with our next class, I want to start setting up 9/11, 2001, when the World Trade Centers were attacked. Because a lot of the original grievances against a lot of Middle Eastern Muslims began in World War I. And so I want to start setting up some of these events that are happening in World War I that eventually results in 9/11 and a lot of the grievances that you can trace back to World War I. So I want to talk about that. I also want to talk about the Russian Revolution. When the Soviets take over Russia and Russia becomes a communist country. So that's what we're going to talk about next time. Originally, this class I just did was supposed to be in person today, and I wanted to have some discussion and talk about some things in the war. But unfortunately, that class did not happen today. So hopefully we can have that discussion soon. We can talk about all of the stuff we're talking about. So thank you for joining me. Join me back next time too.